Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
If you're sitting around a room of people and you're trying to get nerd information, like I was just sitting around in a big discussion, 50 years of the Endangered Species Act. How do we get information without having to read the Federal Register, which is, the daily list of code laws passed in the federal government in our bureaucracy? How do we find out what's going on in the government, in Interior, in the National Park Service, and all these places that impact people that care about fish and wildlife? How can we find that information out? There's nowhere to go other than reading the Federal Register. So you need people that bridge the gap, taking the stuff where it's like watching paint dry, like peer-reviewed scientific articles paywalled by $35, and people who are willing to take their time for no professional benefit, like y'all, make these types of podcasts for people to listen to. It's the only way.
Kelly, one thing I've talked to Will about it and other colleagues as well, it's almost like in science, in our discipline, I don't know about other ones, but it certainly is in ours. It's like there's a stigma there
of being public
from our
facing
colleagues.
Yeah.
So, in other words, like if I publish an article and then share it as widely as I can with as many people as possible, it's viewed as like shameless self-promotion or something. And it's like I'm not promoting me. I'm trying to get information that I and a whole bunch of graduate students and technicians and taxpayer dollars and all the other things that are going into that. I'm trying to get that out to as many people so they can use it and know about it and gain knowledge from it as possible. And there's this perception that seems to linger around that is just trying to self-promote. But, and then I've gotten to the point where it irritated me to the level. I was like, you know what? I'm sharing everybody's stuff. If it's good science, I'm sharing it everywhere I can, elevate everybody. Like we need to be getting good science out to as many people as possible. And yeah, go ahead, Will.
But where this gets really strange for me, Marcus, is you're right. And I've experienced that same reaction. Kelly probably has too from colleagues and peers. But then those same people that might criticize you for that would then applaud you for being a plenary session speaker at a major conference in front of 500, 1,000 attendees.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like academia has, established what kind of, public engagement is acceptable. And I think a lot of that is traditional versus what is, less well received. I don't know, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. What's even been, I have plenty of colleagues that I also consider friends that, they poke at me about trying to get content to go viral.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not doing that because I want me to go viral.
For
I
ego.
want everybody to know what nesting cover looks like because I would like there to be more turkeys.
And like Kelly said, we're competing with those public-facing figures, sometimes celebrities, and they're the ones that are getting their story in front of thousands. And so how else are we supposed to compete with that?
Yeah, you're trying to compete with the potentially audience that's enormous, that may be completely, I mean, sometimes it's good information. We shouldn't say it's always bad information, but sometimes it's bad information on a platform that's enormous. And then you're trying to counter that. How do you do that? You're certainly not going to do it by publishing it and then walking away and hoping that it gets disseminated somehow.
The other thing, too, is that, and I don't really know what to call this group of folks, like maybe animal rights, but that's not quite what it is. Maybe just strict preservationist, non-consumptive user, animal rights types. they have a very far head start on podcasts like yours. And, there are some very big hunting and fishing podcasts, of course.
Mm-hmm.
However, when I listen to my students say, oh, Dr. Dunning, have you heard this podcast? And they tell me what it is, and I go look it up. I'm like, oh my goodness, you're listening to this activist type podcast that if you really listen to and follow through their logical framework down to, just core principles, people that want to end all fishing, most of the world gets its protein from fishing. People that want to end all hunting, I mean, do you want to go and harvest wild caught seasonal game, or do you want to get, factory farm turkey? So these are, you have to meet the next generation where they are too. And I know for a fact, because I listen very closely to where my students are getting their information from. And these are, some of the most educated 19, 20, 21-year-olds you can find on topics of fish and wildlife. They're getting their information, whether we like it or not, from TikTok, from Instagram, and from podcasts. So the more that you can do to build up this next generation of hunters and anglers, it's just so important, because having them engaged in the right way and not fall into these, these mentalities where if your fun isn't my fun, it should be banned. Or on the opposite, there are hunting and fishing personalities in the media that just spread conspiracy theories around about wildlife diseases and stuff like that. So it goes both ways, and it's folks like you that really have to fight that, so that I don't have to hear my students talking about, ending all.
Maybe I need to have a separate discussion with you about what the kids these days or where they're getting information. But
yeah, Kelly, didn't you tell me one time that they like use TikTok as their version of Google?
95% of searches for people in their 20s are done over TikTok and not Google. And that's from the New York Times. That's not.
I don't have anything to say about that.
I don't get it.
I mean, seriously though,
the TikTok account is all I'm saying, because that the other side does, and that the conspiracy mongers do.
Yeah.
And to further what y'all were saying about our senior colleagues and more established academics, they very much criticize young people's stuff, despite young people being our core constituents, right?
Mm-hmm.
Young people are the next generations of hunters and anglers. Young people are the next generation of wildlife biologists. If we don't meet them where they are, podcast, TikTok, Instagram, and I'm a hypocrite because I don't know how to do this stuff, but I don't have as much reach as this podcast. If we don't meet them where they are, they're not going to get the right stuff, but they're going to be listening to people who just have fundamentally non-science-based views on species and habitats and things like that.
Well, what I was going to say, I'm super curious about this, and I have a student, a PhD student, working on this right now, currently in her program. But I have been trying to figure out ways to communicate to different age groups, and we can't crack the college age student group. We they don't listen to the pod. I mean, there's some, we have some listeners in that age group, but it's very unusual for me to interact with students at my university that know that we have a outreach program. And then I ask out of curiosity, like, what's happening. And, it's sort of like work, for students that are engaged in our field to listen to their professor talk about something. So, I just don't, we've talked a lot about how to decrease the age, which we have some, various sources of data showing the traditional extension models and what age group that targets. We are significantly younger than that on average, and much more representative across age classes than some of the traditional ways to communicate. But it's been, I guess I'm just the old guy now that's trying to figure out how to communicate with young ones. I don't know how to do it. It's just such an interesting thing. As much as we've tried to jump on with new technology and be the leader, in our field, we're still way behind.
Do you guys do the short stuff, the reels, the TikTok stuff? I think that's where it is. So you do put that up there?
It's apparently not watchable I mean, I ask the students; they give me really good feedback on it all the
Yeah.
time, just trying to figure out. And we have interns that we're people in the age group trying to help, and it's just a really interesting thing. It's just not the right type of content, I guess, to be
Yeah.
engaging.
I think
And
that's the difference though between you and most people who are trying to do what you're doing. And I just base this off conversations with senior people in the field. You say, I listen to people in their 20s. I've asked them, I've hired people in their 20s. Not everybody does that. Not everybody respects 19 to 21-year-olds enough to listen to them. And that's a huge gap in what we do and what we can do. And not, just because their fun isn't our fun. TikTok, Instagram, that's not where we spend our time. We still have to respect it as their main conduit for
Mhm.
information. And I think the fact that you're listening and learning and like letting young people teach you, that's a place where most people in our field and in wider, different disciplines as well, that's where people fall down, is they won't even ask young folks where and how they're consuming information.
Yeah, well, it's not been very effective,
I
but
think it will be. I think if you keep at it, I
it's
think it will
trying.
be.
I mean, it's just one of those things where we have the generation right now that owns land, and then we're pretty well, I think, based on the demographics of the podcast and our social media and everything, we're reaching people that have just gotten or are about to take over. The land management decision making and stuff. And then there's a lot of concern about the next generation, whether or not they're even going to value outdoor recreation and these resources. And, I feel obligated, I guess, for some sense to try to engage that age group as well. And I don't know how to do it very well.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about, the challenges facing the next generation of hunter, angler, land managers, I've said it before, eggs are $20. Nothing is affordable. The median house price is up, what, 20%? I mean, what hope do they have on 7% interest of mortgaging a house? Sure, they'll inherit it, but property taxes have doubled. I mean, it's a very bleak future for a lot of young people. And imagine coming up in a state like Texas, where 99% of land is privately owned. And if you want to get out there to a state park or a WMA or something like that, you kind of got to enter these online reservation systems. You can't just show up, right?
Mm.
So I think there's some structural problems and some real kind of resource problems facing the youngest generation today that we didn't have it great in our generation with the recession happening right when many of us graduated school and stuff like that. But the prospects that folks 10, 20 years younger than us face are it's hard to buy into something that takes a little bit of resources, even just money to buy a hunting, fishing license, firearms, ammunition, let alone land and property. It's hard to ask people to care whenever we kind of set them up to fail, and I don't know what the solution is to that. I really don't. But I think maybe some of the alienation from these types of things comes from just like a lack of economic opportunity. And I'm not here to start the revolution. I'm a very moderate person, but I do feel that, young people, what resources do they have to get started?
Well,
I
yeah,
said, eggs cost $20.
yeah. I mean, I started just thinking about where my head was at that point in time. Um, passionate hunter, starting to try to do some small land management stuff on the places that I had permission to hunt. But, a lot of the things that, everything that I read back then was in print, in these hunting and fishing magazines, and like, you know, uh, Farming for Wildlife had just started being published by Mossy Oak, and that was some land management stuff. And then Quality Whitetails was putting out land management stuff, but there weren't a lot of those land management oriented publications. Most of it was just like, read about my hunting trip to this exotic location, right? But when I would read those, a lot of the stuff was just so far beyond my reach when I was in the college age class that you're talking about, Kelly. Like, how am I going to buy, enough herbicide that it's going to cost me $65 an acre to treat, these few acres that I need to treat. How can I afford that? How can I afford the gas to even get out there to spray it? So I think some of that, their reach is self-limited because those folks aren't at a stage in their life yet where they're capable of financing things like that.
Yep, totally agree.
Well, and when I'm thinking back, I was the same, hunting, fishing. That was what I was thinking about. And, I'm fortunate to have a little place from in my family that I can go and tinker around with stuff. But even at that age, I wasn't really in the mindset yet to be thinking about how to how to manage the resource sustainability. Like, I was thinking about how do I get on that big gobbler? What where do I need to crawl? What do I need to how do I
Right.
need to set up an approach? Like, all that kind of stuff was what was in my head, which, that led ultimately to where we're at. But yeah. And
I think
I
a
think
lot
we've
of what we're asked, I didn't mean to cut you off, Marcus.
oh, go ahead.
I think a lot of what we're asking students to do, like in my world in particular, you said, when I ask students about what they think about our podcast, it feels like work to them. When I ask students, even our avid hunter angler students, of which we have many, when I ask them, hey, when's the last time you were on our Fish and Game Agency website? When's the last time you gave a public comment? When's the last time you went to a public meeting for this thing that you really care about, that this last commission meeting talked about, that we had public comment meetings all around the state for? They're like, I don't have time. I roll burritos. I clean toilets. I do this, I do that. I don't have time to do that. That's work. But you're comparing, or you're complaining about slot size or bag limit on redfish. And we had these meetings all over the state and you didn't go, and you didn't even have to go. You could have submitted public comment. So what I'm dealing with, which is similar to what you're dealing with, is how do you get people, especially young people, to feel like keeping abreast of what's going on with this sort of stuff is not work, and it will actually impact you next hunting and fishing season when you're out there.
So that kind of brings us back with the public meetings that you mentioned. It brings us back to something that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about is, how to state agencies. Well, I mean, we don't just need to look at it from state agency perspective, although we do have a lot of state agency biologists that listen to this podcast, but we also have a lot of hunters too. And so, what does an effective relationship between those two entities look like when it comes to this push pull of I want as much access to the resources I can get versus we have to make sure that there's enough left over for next year?
Yeah. Well, just like, I'm really hard on academics that publish articles and just say, whoever finds them, and whoever reads them, reads them. My job is done, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with fish and wildlife policymakers, decision makers, managers, biologists. Because whether you like it or not, even if you're a biologist in a fish and game agency, you're still a policymaker. So you owe the public some type of engagement work. It's true. So what an effective relationship looks like is people taking responsibility and not saying, I have a 400-page technical report on habitat distribution, recruitment of turkeys. I'm going to post it on my Facebook page. That's engagement. And everybody that doesn't like it, I'm going to turn off comments for you. And this happens, right? It happens in my field with professors. It happens in that field with fish and wildlife decision makers. That is not effective engagement. People treat public engagement and communications and this and that like anybody can do it. It's a soft science. It's BS. It's really not. It makes a difference in whether people actually listen and comply with your regulations. It makes a difference in whether people purchase a license, whether they feel motivated to go hunting and fishing. So it impacts your bottom line. And effective engagement starts with, we talk all the time in our department about the public trust doctrine, right? And I always return back to these. These are like civics lessons, right? We have to understand what that is. And we get international students in our classes, and they are fascinated by this idea that Americans own fish and wildlife. Even really close Five Eyes cousins, like people in the UK, you don't own fish and wildlife as a UK citizen. We do. You have to have a pretty big estate in England to go hunting and fishing on.
Right.
We do. So they Fish and Wildlife, you are keeping this trust on behalf of the beneficiaries, us, the public, right? So your duty in that relationship is to understand what the public wants. And you have to do that through meaningful engagement, not just sending out horrible to read reports to people and saying, this is why we made this decision. No, you have to involve people from the get go whenever you're even considering a decision to be made, or else people won't comply. They won't do what you want. You can't dictate to people in the United States. In the United States, especially, people don't like being told what to do. It's in our revolutionary DNA. So you really have to partner hand in hand with people from the beginning if you're kind of fulfilling your mandate in the public trust. And then on the other side, on the flip side, members of the public, especially hunters and anglers who are, I don't know if we're actually losing our grip on the decision-making power, our grip on having a voice in these types of things, or if that's just kind of wishful thinking on the part of academics who don't necessarily like gun culture and stuff like that. But the hunting and fishing public, you have an obligation to be on these fish and game websites every day of your life. If you read the newspaper, you need to read your fish and game website. You need to find out when the meetings are happening. You need to go to the meetings. You need to learn these people's names, and you need to let them know what you're seeing out there, because just like fish and game decision makers, policymakers have an obligation to protect this resource for you, you have an obligation to listen and learn from them, but also to pass them information from the bottom up. So it's a two-way street. And I think oftentimes a lot of the resentment towards fish and game comes from this idea, well, they're not listening to us. Well, are you going to meetings? Are you leaving public comment? Oftentimes the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, I know that there's a biologist sitting there listening to this right now, and he's thinking, that all sounds great, theoretically, but I go to the public meeting and I explain to, this audience that I need to make this regulation change because we completed this research and it showed that that was the most limiting factor for this population. But then I have, two or three guys show up that just want to yell at me about it's not that, it's this. And they all have their own pet hypothesis, whether it be, I could throw out a million
Mm-hmm.
different ones, and it doesn't seem like a productive conversation to them. What would you say to that person? I mean, are we focusing too much on those naysayers, and the reality is we're getting through to 75% of people? Because it could quickly become frustrating, right?
I totally hear this biologist, and I would like this biologist to email me, because this is actually what a lot of people study at places like the Consensus Building Institute and the Harvard Program on Negotiation, how to have really effective meetings between people who despise one another. And I'm
Mm,
talking about in situations where there's ongoing genocide or water conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians, like far spicier conflicts than what we're talking about right now. These people that work on how you have effective two-way listening sessions in meetings have kind of gotten to the bottom of some of these problems. Not solved them, but just made progress in them. And if they can
Mm-hmm.
do it, y'all can do it too. And the way that you do that is by, and you guys have children, right? Whenever you come into a kindergarten classroom, there's a chart and it has rules on it. You have to have a chart with rules on it at the beginning of every meeting. Who gets to speak? How often do they speak? How many times do you get to speak in a room of 300 people? These are ground rules that you can set it collaboratively in the beginning of a meeting. If you have a well facilitated meeting with a neutral facilitator, not someone from Fish and Game, you can have a court appointed certified mediator run your
hmm
meeting for you. It probably costs you $30 to get this person in there for an hour. There's so many ways that if you've sat through these disastrous public meetings before, if you have some good ground rules in place, you have a neutral mediator, you have this perception from the public like, ooh, there's a system here. I'm not going to be able to monopolize this and torment these biologists like I usually do. Ooh, there's a facilitator up here. I'm not going to be able to mess with these young guys like I used to. There should not be one or two people bullying the jukebox and having the entire time for themselves. That's just a poorly run meeting. And
Mm-hmm.
there's books on this. There's free guides online for how to run your meetings better, and you can do it. Even if you just make small changes over time, you can run more effective meetings where you get really good engagement with the public, but you don't let it, like, your usual frequent flyers torment you in these types of things. It's possible.
Maybe we need some TikTok content on that. Well, I think there's another side to it is the people that are really angry or the squeaky wheel, right? Those are the people that show up.
Mm-hmm.
The people in support don't.
Yeah.
And then so you got the people that are mad, or the people that have a financial interest, or whatever. There are some different reasons why there might be a really strong interest in a particular topic, and those people show up, and the people that are often the majority, that might be in support or not really feel strongly about it as it stands, don't show up. So that becomes the other question you were talking about, is how do you get people there?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the ways that we lure people to our events is
Pizza.
food, free food.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
rolling for a Bass Pro Shop gift card goes a long way. But that's kind of facetious answers. Like, the way that you get more people to show up for these things is giving people the impression that showing up matters and why it
Mm-hmm.
matters. I met a friend recently who was putting on an art show on nature. And, he started to kind of preach to me about how hunting and fishing is bad and this and that. And, he didn't even know, despite putting on an entire show and performance on nature in Alabama, how much conservation is funded by hunters and anglers. This person eats meat, right? So, like, a lot of the non-hunting public doesn't understand PR stuff, public trust stuff, why hunters and fishers have a duty to kind of have input on this stuff.
We still
And
have a
it's not,
long way to go.
yeah, like, it was just very surprising to me. It's like, you have so much interest in conservation and nature, and no one's ever talked to you about this. This is wild to me. So I don't really know how to get past that, but the solution, which is what I don't know how to get to, is having more people, whether they're hunters and anglers or not, having more people feel like their presence at that meeting will matter.
Mm-hmm.
Is that social media, or is social media going against that? Like, do people get on social media and they feel so alienated from their peers? And, like, I think right now in the United States, I love this country. I've worked all over the world. I would never want to be anywhere else, right? But I do feel like our social fabric is very frayed right now. We don't trust one another the way that we used to. We don't hear dissenting voices the way that we used to. I think this is amplified and agitated by social media, even in our little quiet backwater fish and wildlife studies, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
people
Oh,
are just,
absolutely.
so, like, do you think that social media has the power to make the public, whether they're hunters and anglers or not, do you think social media has the power to convince people, hey, if I show up to this meeting, this is a good thing for my community? Or do you think it just alienates people further from wanting to show up? These are the sorts of things that we think about and we don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that.
I don't either. I mean, I'm one of those. I actually didn't have any social media before I started trying to use it for communication,
Mm-hmm.
and still don't use it for personal reasons for the most part. You'd be remiss to find something personal online about, on one of those platforms. There's probably something somewhere, but I'm principally am using it because I see the power and utility of it to reach a lot of people with good
Right.
information. But it is very difficult to navigate what is good information, what isn't.
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword, and I think it's clear that it's played a huge role in the modern hunter being more educated on biology and management of game species than they ever have been. I
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's hard to deny. I mean, there's still a lot of
Oh yeah.
misinformation out there, but I mean, people. I didn't even I didn't even know. I'm almost embarrassed to admit this. I probably admitted it on the air before though, so here goes. But
There's nothing that can bring you down from where you're at.
early in my deer hunting career, when I was a kid, I didn't even know that larger, older bucks had larger antlers. I just thought some bucks had large antlers and some had small
Mhm.
ones. So, coming from that as a starting point, I guess it's not hard for people to be more educated than they used to be. But I mean, there's so many folks out there that know way more, I think, than they ever have.
Mhm. I do. I think a lot of the media and these different ways for mass communication are attributable to a lot of that knowledge.
Yeah.
But it also has amplified things that may not be true, or it's given everybody the microphone essentially. So you know, it's hard to distinguish data-driven inference from opinion.
Hmm.
I've also
So,
heard fish and game officials, just like I've heard professors, and I expect this from professors. But I was kind of more surprised to hear it from some fish and game colleagues. I won't say, what state it's from, but just a general kind of, I guess it's like kind of hostility, but light hostility. It's not like downright vitriolic hostility. It's like just kind of like, what do they know? They don't know. Like, I work on this stuff. What do they know? Well,
Hmm.
it's sort of your role to get them that information.
Hmm.
And I understand that you may not like Facebook. You may not like Instagram. You may not like typing up a mailer that you then have to send out to everyone, but that's your role. And, we hear professors with this sort of stuff all the time. I mean, some professors that I know even resent teaching undergraduates. It's like, that's your core constituency right there. But
mhm,
I think we, as folks, who come from an educated background in this area, we have to also do some reflecting and do a better job about like maybe some internalized resentment that we may have to our public. And I understand the public can be wacky sometimes. Like, I've been called every name under the sun at public meetings. I've been told that I'm, conspiring with the Chinese Communist Party to do this and that.
Are you?
Wild accusations. Am I on the record right now? But that's just par for the course. Like, you're gonna get, some folks just hit you with stuff from left field, but we can't let this resentment
mhm,
turn us off to engaging with the public. And to further that, especially because we're sort of experts in research, right? I have met fish and game decision makers before who seem to be hostile towards research.
Hmm.
And as a land grant school, Florida, Auburn, Wyoming, I kind of just had this ignorance almost where state fish and game people were going to come knocking on my door saying, hey, here's a survey I want to put out for hunters. Here's a survey I want to put out for anglers. And when that didn't happen, and when I got, and I won't say what state this is from, but when I got a call at 5 p.m. on a Friday about one of my surveys, and they didn't quite ask me to take questions out, but they would have liked it if I did. And they implied very heavily that they would have liked me to take some questions out. It's like, hold on. We're supposed to be doing this in tandem together. If you don't want to know what people think about this certain type of wildlife management or disease management, what are we doing here? We're literally
mhm,
paid by taxpayers to do this.
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. I think all of us have some of that guilt to share for criticizing the others. The public, I think, looks at us as researchers as, these pointy head academics that don't spend time afield. And the biologists, look at us as being up in this ivory tower and not being in touch with what they're actually seeing on the ground kind of similarly. And there's the opposing views between the biologists and the public. It goes in all directions. But what I think is one of the most powerful things that you've said today during our conversation, because I've never really thought about it this way, is that biologists owe it to the public to interface with them in some capacity. And that's
mhm,
going to vary, from one biologist position to another and depending, on what their role and responsibility is. But I've never really looked at it like that unless you're, someone that has an extension appointment or an extension
mhm.
specialist. So that was kind
Your
of
Well,
thought
salary
provoking
is
for
funded
me.
by the taxpayer. If the taxpayer is
yeah,
paying your salary and you work for a fish and wildlife agency in your state that is part of the executive branch of the state government, you are a public official. Even if you are a biologist, even if you don't have public affairs specialist in your job description, how many times has someone run into you at the pub or something like that and said, what do you think about this CWD regulation? Or what do you think about this redfish regulation? You have to have something ready for that moment, because whether you like it or not, if your salary is paid for by the taxpayer, you are going to have to engage with people. But the beauty in that is the people who you are most likely to change their minds are close friends and family members who would feel comfortable grabbing you by the shoulders and asking you these questions. So you have a lot more power and agency than you think you do with folks that are closer to you. I get asked this by students all the time. How do I get people that disagree with me to listen to me? I have the expertise. I've done the reading. Expertise doesn't count for shit. I'm sorry. It doesn't. This is America. We're a democracy. And this is baked into the founding of our democracy. Jeffersonian Democrats viewed it as a beautiful thing when farmers would engage in uprisings over whiskey taxes and stuff like that. It's part of who we are. So even though I have a PhD, I don't think that that grants me an audience with people. In fact, it makes your obligation all that much more to have to listen to people who are out on the resource every day, whether that's trout fishermen in Wyoming or longline tuna fishermen in Indonesia. You have to listen to these people because you are the bridge between the decision-making apparatus and the research apparatus, and one has to include the other.
Yeah, it definitely is difficult, though, when those are often, if not normally, antagonistic interactions. Like if you're getting attacked all the time, I can understand why somebody would be like, well, you know what? I'm just going to avoid communicating at all because all I get is flack about it.
Yeah.
We are a
I
nation
can understand.
founded in conflict, though. Founded in revolutionary conflict. We celebrate our revolution every year. Our national anthem celebrates bombs blowing up in our revolution. Getting attacked by an angry populace is as an American as apple pie. So just get comfortable with it. Get comfortable with it. Fly a little American flag because it's not going away, you know?
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And Kelly, you and I have
can
had.
hear you.
I know. It's like theory versus practice, right?
Yeah.
But Kelly and I have had many conversations about this, about, life was a whole lot simpler when, I would just publish a paper and present it at a couple conferences and call it a day, versus when you open yourself up to all this scrutiny by putting ourselves out here on podcasts and social media and things like that.
Yeah.
It actually has made a lot of things more difficult.
Yeah. Well, even people who know better attack you, Will, for doing this. And I've heard it myself in the halls. What Ghouls be doing on this podcast? Oh, I don't know, reaching thousands and thousands of people that he wouldn't have reached otherwise. I say go for it. Go to the moon. Y'all can. You're winning awards for it. Go to the moon. I'm serious.
Again with the award.
I'm so inspired now.
I'm serious.
Well, I mean, seriously, though, like that is what we're here for. And I mean, Will and I, when we were conceiving this particular podcast, it's like, you know what? There is tons of great work going on turkeys. There are tons of people who have dedicated their life to the conservation of this species and our use of it. We just need to be a point of contact for people to get access to all of that information. And I think so far we've done a pretty good job of broadly, casting that net to try to get a lot of great, minds like yourself on here to talk about different things. I kind of felt like this conversation is something that a lot of people are probably not going to hear out there, but that's what we've got to do. We need to talk about this. Like there are some undesirable interactions that are going to happen, and it's our job to try to navigate that for the betterment of the resource and our use of it. So very important.
Yep.
Yeah. What's kind of wild to me to think about is that if you're, you take a hunter that is not politically engaged, or at least to the extent that it comes to wildlife policy, right? And maybe they own 100 acres that they're intensively managing. They're listening to our podcast because they want input on how to direct that management to achieve their desired outcomes. Until today, I'd never really thought about it this way, but the next level almost of managing that resource would be to become involved in the policy making and in those town hall meetings. Because then, you're managing your individual property, but then you're also potentially benefiting the species and having an impact at a second scale that's even much larger than that. And that's kind of a pretty
Mhm.
powerful way to think about it in my mind that it had never really occurred to me until today.
In the parts of the world, the conservation world that I know best, it's often fishermen, NGOs, 501c3 nonprofits, groups of fishermen who come together and say, you know what, the speckled trout aren't looking so hot right now. You know what, we
Hmm.
just had a deep freeze in our bays and estuaries. We want to take our bag limit down by one fish, or we want
Mhm.
to change our slot size to this or that. And, it happens all the time all over the Gulf. And often, sort of these self limits are placed on ourselves by groups of people like us. Like it's not WWF that's coming in here and advocating to change the slot size of a bull red in Louisiana. It's like groups of fishermen, often groups of
Hmm.
charter boat captains. So, you are very much part of that conversation. In my view, we have the perfect system. The power is devolved to the states. The legislature is devolved to the state agency. Regulations can change really fast.
Mhm.
Laws going through the legislature do not move fast. Courts do not move fast. It's very expensive to bring a lawsuit to the courts. It's hard to prove that you have standing to even bring a lawsuit to the courts. Regulations, on the other hand, you have a lot of say and a lot of flexibility in getting
Mhm.
involved in those things. And if you aren't on that website every day, even the most like low population states, places like Wyoming, you can look and see all of the public meetings about upcoming fish and game regulations for the next year. Every public meeting, it's within a half hour to an hour drive of you. The things that you care about, wolves, bag limits, things like that, you can just go find it right now and go get involved with it. You don't need to get involved with every little thing. If turkeys are your thing, get involved with turkeys and join your local civil society. There's a great book by a guy named Robert Putnam called Bowling for Democracy. I might have butchered the title of something like that, but it's basically what we talked about earlier, how he felt in the 90s, early 2000s, like the social fabric of America was fraying. People don't do stuff face to face anymore. People don't bowl in their community bowling league anymore. I think that we as hunters and anglers, we can kind of get through some of these problems of a frayed social fabric and a lack of community by joining your local chapter of National Wild Turkey Federation, joining your local chapter of CCA, joining the executive board, putting on the annual banquets and stuff like that. It's great. It's a great way to
Mhm.
meet your neighbors.
Hmm.
Well, one thing I wanted to add to this is I felt like for some of that conversation, we did a lot of finger pointing at biologists and academics, but the other side of that, having the the general public be knowledgeable. It's one thing to be passionate about it and have things the way you want to do it, but also, I mean, we have a lot of people that are trying their best to get as good of information out to you as you can. Seek it out. And, if you want to know why a state agency might want to change the bag limit on turkeys, there's probably information out there to try to understand what data is being used, where's the rationale, and help let that inform how you're going to advocate when you're engaged
Hmm.
in these things.
Yeah.
So it's not, all of the legs in this stool need to be there, right? So
And I would
gain
say,
knowledge.
yeah, when I'd say, when you go into that situation, be prepared to ask questions about things that you don't understand or don't add up or align with the direction that you
Hmm.
think that the agency is wanting to go. And they may be able to explain there's a bit of information that you missed that makes it all fall into
Yeah,
place. But I think
or
the
they may,
key, or they may
yeah, they
not
may
have
have
a
right, or they may have data that you're not aware of, like
true.
at the state level or something.
True. So my point is, I think you need to go in being willing and prepared to ask some of those difficult questions, but you need to do so, or I would recommend you do so. If people don't like to be told what to do, we learned that today, right? I would
Yeah,
recommend that you do it with to the best of your ability with an open mind instead of asking a question in an accusatory way. So just
yeah,
try to
that's
come in
difficult.
and when you ask the question, be genuine
Hmm.
in your desire for an answer and not just be waiting to try to bait them into a trap or something.
Yeah.
Don't trust people who pretend like they know everything. There are some very loud podcasters out there who used to be in classic rock bands who pretend like not they pretend.
You've really narrowed it down.
They talk to you as if they are the definitive authority on things that are, quite frankly, rapidly being written about and discovered in the scientific literature.
Mm-hmm.
I am very quick to say I don't know. One thing I love about Will is I say, hey, do you know about this? And he says, no. It's amazing. It's such a humility. We are lacking in humility. For people that say, you know what, I'm not really sure about that, but I can go look it up for you. Or I'm not really sure about that. We're finding a lot about that right now, but I can kind of talk to you about what my understanding is and what my opinion on this is. These are the people that you trust for things. People who can admit they don't know.
Yeah, I do a lot of that. I don't know if that makes me trustworthy, but I definitely have the humility.
Makes you trustworthy or ignorant.
That's a fine line there, you know? So the other thing I was thinking of is we are kind of preaching to the choir, because the people that are listening to this are the people that are trying to gain knowledge and think about it. So if you're out there thinking that way, well, help spread the word. You have an influence over a lot of people to help them get in the mindset to gain knowledge and engage and try to help us all make better decisions for the resource and our use of it. So
that's why I always enjoy conversations with Kelly, is because she always challenges my thinking, and she has very different perspectives than I do on a lot of things.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming on again. Is there anything else, kind of pertinent to all the discussion that we've had today, or turkeys and conservation governance, that you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I've heard so many members of the public just say things like, you can't trust fish and wildlife as far as you can throw them, but my question to you is, you expect a lot out of them, but are you fulfilling your role as an informed and plugged in member of the public? You have a privilege as an American, as a wildlife owner, as a public land owner, to be involved in this stuff, whether you hunt and fish or not. I challenge you, to not just criticize fish and wildlife biologists, decision makers, commissioners, but to also be actively involved, even if that's just a tiny little step that you take in that direction. Leave one public comment over the next 12 months and you'll have met my challenge. Have your voice heard, because in many parts of the world, and I've worked in these parts of the world, you don't have the opportunity to dialogue with decision makers and regulators the way that we do here. So take advantage of it, especially if it's something you care about.
Awesome.
Yeah, very good. Well, we like to provide people with as much transparency and access as we can. So I know we've referenced several things. We might follow up with you to try to get some links to things that we can provide in the show notes. But also, you said earlier for people to email you. Is that the best way to contact you if people want to follow up with you?
Yeah, I would love for anybody who wants to get in touch with me. I'm in flux now. I have 2 different institutional email addresses. Probably one of the best ways to find me is just Googling my name, Kelly Heber Dunning, and my Twitter will come up. You can send me a message there. I have an institutional email address, khd@auburn.edu. Happy to help people run better meetings, have some ideas for how to avoid just train wrecks of meetings, but anything I can do to help fish and wildlife folks, policymakers, members of the general public get more plugged in, please reach out. Happy to hear from you.
Okay. Well, I think we've been going on for quite a while now. It was really, really awesome conversation and very different from our typical conversation. So I appreciate that. I think one of the reasons we've been attracted to academia is because we like the challenge of thought and through different perspectives and all that. So it was really, really awesome, and I appreciate you taking some time to talk to us about it.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.